Something is clearly going very, very wrong inside Sony PlayStation right now. And I don't mean just one thing. I don't mean just one bad game or one bad decision or one studio having a rough year. I mean something structural, something that goes all the way to the top, something that has been quietly building up over this entire PS5 generation, while most of us were just hoping the next announcement would fix it. And it hasn't, because the starting point for all of this, the place you have to go first if you want to understand what's actually happening, is Naughty Dog. Yeah, Naughty Dog, of all the places to start talking about PlayStation falling apart, it's the studio that was supposed to be the one thing they could always count on. And I want to be real clear about what Naughty Dog actually is, because I think some people have kind of forgotten, or maybe they just don't know the full weight of what that name meant for a very long time. We are talking about one of the most legendary studios in the entire history of video games. These are the people who gave us Uncharted. These are the people who gave us The Last of Us. These are the people who gave us Crash Bandicoot. This is not some mid-tier studio that got lucky once. This is a name that for literal decades was basically synonymous with the idea that a PlayStation game was going to be something special, like genuinely special, not just good, not just solid, something that stopped the whole conversation when it came out. The same way Rockstar drops a game and the entire industry just kind of goes quiet for a while and pays attention, Naughty Dog had that. And unlike a lot of other studios that had big legacies and then started disappointing people, Naughty Dog always delivered, always. You could say a lot about The Last of Us Part 2, and believe me, there is a lot to say, especially about the story, which was honestly kind of a disaster, but technically that game is a 10. Like, nobody serious is arguing otherwise. Naughty Dog always elevated the bar, always surprised, but here's where things started going sideways. Because after The Last of Us Part 2, something changed. The audience reaction was devastating. Not in terms of sales necessarily, because the game sold because it's a sequel to one of the biggest franchises of the generation and people were going to buy it regardless. But in terms of image, in terms of how people felt about Naughty Dog walking out the other side of that game, it was bad. The story, the characters, the choices they made narratively, all of it generated this massive wave of backlash from the fan base that I don't think Naughty Dog or Sony were fully prepared for. And in my opinion, a big part of why the story fell apart is exactly what we talk about later with the broader industry problem, woke culture bleeding into the creative process. When the writing starts serving an ideological agenda instead of serving the characters and the audience feels it, and they felt it hard with The Last of Us Part 2. Story, the characters, the choices they made narratively, all of it generated this massive wave of backlash from the fan base that I don't think Naughty Dog or Sony were fully prepared for. And it seems like Sony felt that hit too, because when you actually look at what Naughty Dog has delivered for the PS5 generation, like actually look at it, the picture is pretty thin, man. The only release was The Last of Us Part 1 Remake, which is a PS3 game remade. You can't even really call that a new game. My read on that situation is that the only actual reason that Remake exists is to have something at full price on store shelves right when the HBO series was premiering and everyone was newly interested in the franchise again. Which, okay, commercially, maybe that's a smart move, maybe, but it's not a new experience. It's not what a studio with Naughty Dog's talent and resources and history should be putting out as their flagship PS5 contribution. And the only truly new project we know about is Intergalactic, which has been in development for years already and probably isn't arriving before 2027. And honestly, being very generous with that estimate, probably 2028. And when you compare that to what Naughty Dog was able to do during the PS3 era, the gap is kind of staggering. Like, in that same generation, that studio managed to make an entire Uncharted trilogy and still find time to ship The Last of Us. Uncharted 2 was made in something like 2 years or a little over, which is practically unheard of by today's standards. Sure, people will say games now are just on a completely different scale in terms of scope and graphical fidelity and all that. And yeah, that's true. But the bigger truth that nobody wants to say out loud is that Sony just doesn't have enough first-party software to actually define this platform. And the majority of what has come out on PS5, God of War, Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, isn't even exclusive anymore. It's on PC, which kind of makes the PS5 maybe the least necessary console generation in PlayStation's entire history, because practically everything you want to play on it can be found somewhere else. That's a problem. And then there's Intergalactic itself. This game, that is supposed to be Naughty Dog's big redemption play for this generation, the thing that's supposed to restore the faith, restore the goodwill, it was already at war with its own audience before it even launched. From the moment it was announced, it has been collecting controversies like it's trying to set a record. The drama around the director, the drama around the writers, the marketing, the lead actress, everything is working against the fans. The people who are supposed to be excited about this game are not excited. They're skeptical at best, hostile at worst, and they haven't even played it yet. Now, technically, when the game does come out, we'll probably get something impressive. Beautiful graphics, great acting, fun gameplay. That's what Naughty Dog knows how to do, and they'll probably do it. But the story, the characters, the narrative choices, those are exactly the parts that drove people away in The Last of Us Part 2. And from what we've seen of Intergalactic so far, I can't honestly say I'm convinced they've learned anything. And that leads to the uncomfortable question that nobody at Sony seems to want to answer yet, which is, if Intergalactic flops, what happens to Naughty Dog? I don't think it'll flop at Concord levels, like absolute zero, nuclear devastation kind of flop, because Naughty Dog is still too big a name for the general public to just straight up ignore. But if it doesn't hit its targets, if it underperforms badly enough, the next project isn't getting a blank check. Sony is going to tighten the screws. And we've seen this movie before. Bluepoint, the studio behind genuinely flawless remakes, Shadow of the Colossus, Demon's Souls, a catalog that generated real money and real appreciation, got shut down just a few months ago. Just like that. Sony is not showing mercy lately, man. So Naughty Dog needs to wake up, needs to get its act together, because the walls are closing in whether anyone wants to admit that or not. And it's exactly in that context that Jason Schreier, Bloomberg journalist, one of the most respected people in this industry for his sourcing and his concrete, reliable leaks, goes and throws more fuel on the fire. Someone asked him on Blue Sky about how Sony apparently has no problem letting Naughty Dog spend over $300 million across more than 5 years on a single-player game that so far has produced nothing, but then gets cold feet about investing in a new shooter with an already established fan base, like a Destiny 3 would be. And Schreier's response was simple: they definitely have a problem with that. And immediately the internet went absolutely crazy, with everyone reading that as Sony being specifically directly angry at Naughty Dog, which, okay, understandable reaction. But Schreier went back and clarified. He said his comment had been taken out of context. The actual situation, according to him, was that Sony didn't approve Destiny 3 because of high costs. Someone had made the comment that Sony would obviously have a problem with Bungie's spending, but not Naughty Dog's. And what Schreier was saying is that no, Sony has a problem with both. Not because they're specifically angry at any one studio, but because there is a structural problem where game budgets are blowing past $300 million, while the market hasn't grown fast enough to keep pace with that. That's the real story, as he framed it. But even accepting that clarification, and I think Schreier is probably right in the technical sense, the real question doesn't go away. If Sony had zero discomfort with Naughty Dog, zero concern, zero hesitation, would they just approve whatever project that studio put on the table? Because we're talking about a studio that for years had basically total carte blanche, infinite goodwill, infinite trust, infinite resources, because these people always delivered. It's the same relationship Take-Two has with Rockstar. You don't cut corners with them, you don't second guess them, you give them what they need, because you know the result is going to be a game for the ages. That's what Naughty Dog was, until The Last of Us Part 2 came along with all the controversy and split the fan base straight down the middle. So yes, there's a budget problem, but there's also a trust problem. And those two things together create a very fragile situation for the studio, and I don't think enough people are talking about how serious that combination actually is. And it's not just Naughty Dog, because this isn't a Naughty Dog story. This is a PlayStation story. The astronomical budgets in games that don't deliver the expected returns, that's a symptom of something much deeper. To actually understand the size of the hole Sony has dug for itself this generation, you have to look at what has effectively become their live service graveyard, because there's no other honest way to describe it. Sony made this big strategic pivot away from its comfort zone of linear single-player games, your Last of Us, your God of War, your Uncharted, your Spider-Man, and decided to go all in on games as a service, multiplayer, always online, live forever. And what they got instead is a digital cemetery, because essentially nothing is working. From Concord to Marathon, everywhere you look in Sony's live service portfolio, it's flops, just flop after flop after flop. The most recent example is Destruction All-Stars. This was supposed to be a PS5 launch title, an arena car combat game, pseudo-exclusive, meant to make a statement about what the new generation could do. It failed to find an audience basically from day one, and now it's getting the Concord treatment servers offline, game removed from storefronts. Sony confirmed it with the usual corporate phrasing. Due to ongoing technical issues, Destruction All-Stars multiplayer services will remain offline. Ongoing technical issues. Sure, guys, we know what that means. That's the corporate translation of this game flopped and we're done. Destruction All-Stars launched in February 2021. It was supposed to be a launch title, got delayed, came in at a below-average price, and still couldn't find anyone who wanted it. A few months after launch, it was already free on PlayStation Plus. And even free for subscribers, no purchase required, it couldn't fill a lobby. Man, think about that for a second. In a game with maybe 10 to 12 players, in a lobby at a time, a lobby that small couldn't fill up. It was already a ghost town, already completely empty, but Destruction All-Stars is just one more name on the list. There was Foam Stars, that Square Enix PlayStation exclusive that was basically trying to be Splatoon but with soap, another live service game that got zero traction and just kind of faded out like it never existed. And looking at what's still in the pipeline, it doesn't get more encouraging. There's Fair Games, the Payday-style heist thing with the steal from billionaires narrative. There's Horizon Hunters Gathering, the arena games set in the Horizon universe. These games exist. I just find it really hard to believe Sony is going to crack the live service formula with these particular bets. And what makes this extra frustrating, like genuinely maddening, is that Sony canceled exactly the things that might have actually worked. There was a The Last of Us multiplayer game, Factions, an established franchise, a massive built-in fan base that was actively waiting for it and asking for it and had been since the original game, and Sony just canceled it. They threw it in the trash. The things with established franchises and captive audiences got canceled. The games with no fan base and controversial designs got hundreds of millions of dollars in full studio support. I genuinely cannot follow Sony's logic here. I've tried. It makes no sense. And this is where the Bungie story lands with its full weight. Because remember, Sony bought Bungie for somewhere between $3.5 and $4 billion, specifically to be the anchor of this whole live service transformation, to be the guide, the model, the example that would show other PlayStation studios how to do this. And what did Bungie actually deliver? Marathon is flopping, mass layoffs are being prepared, potentially close to half the studio, $1.5 billion in accumulated losses since the acquisition. Destiny 3, not approved. And Bungie currently has no game in development. Not one. Zero. The studio that made Halo, the studio that built Destiny from scratch and made it one of the most played games in the world. That studio is sitting completely idle right now with nothing to show. That is an absolutely stunning fall. And the Destiny 2 situation isn't just about Marathon flopping either, because you have to understand, the series of decisions over the years that gradually drove the fan base away before any of this even happened. Why was Destiny 2 vaulting content that people actually paid real money for? The Red War campaign, which was Destiny 2's main campaign at launch, the thing the game was built around. The reason the game existed, you can't play it today. Gone. The Forsaken expansion, which is widely considered one of the best things Bungie ever made, a genuinely great dark revenge narrative vaulted. Classic raids like Leviathan, Scourge of the Past, Crown of Sorrow, gone, erased, no longer accessible. And Sony, since acquiring Bungie, has done basically nothing to bring any of that content back. And then they wonder why the numbers aren't there. Like, come on. Now, and this is where it gets interesting, or maybe just bleak, depending on how you look at it. What does all of this actually have in common? The Bungie disaster, the Naughty Dog situation, the live service graveyard, the canceled games, the shut down studios. What is the thread connecting all of it? Because there is one, and it becomes even clearer when you look at what is happening in the global market right now. Korean and Chinese games are absolutely demolishing Western games, not barely beating them, not edging them out, demolishing so thoroughly that even the developers themselves, not fans online, not critics, the actual Japanese creators are publicly saying so. Yoko Taro, creator of Nier, Hideaki Itsuno, creator of Devil May Cry, and even Sony itself through Christian Svensson, Sony Interactive's VP of Content Ventures, who straight up said that the pace at which Chinese and South Korean teams are working is surprising, and that their scale and responsiveness is something they're not seeing in Western or even Japanese teams. These are Sony's own people saying this, and the numbers back it up completely. Crimson Desert sold 5 million copies in just a few months. Stellar Blade sold 6.1 million copies. Black Myth Wukong sold 25 million copies worldwide, 7.5 million of those in the West alone. Lies of P reached 4 million. Now look at the Western side in the same period. Outriders World Slayer sold less than 1 million in 3 months. Marathon sold 1.2 million units. Star Wars Outlaws reached 1 million. Assassin's Creed Shadows may have sold just over 2 million. The difference is right there in the numbers. It's not subtle, it's glaring. And here's what I think is important to understand about that difference. Because it's not that Korean and Chinese games are necessarily more innovative. They're not reinventing the wheel in terms of gameplay or world building or any of that. Most of them are games we've seen conceptually similar versions of before. The real differentiator, the thing that connects directly back to everything happening at Sony, is that Western games are being surrounded by attempts to embed identity politics into the product, while Korean and Chinese games are just making games for people who play games. They're making them for the actual gaming audience, which is predominantly male, without a political agenda being forced into the design, and the reflection of that in the market is direct and undeniable. Sony launches Destruction All-Stars with character designs that feel forcedly diverse and that nobody wanted to engage with even when the game was free. Stellar Blade sells 6 million copies. Naughty Dog spends years and hundreds of millions on a project surrounded by writer controversies pushing narratives the fan base has already said it doesn't want. Crimson Desert sells 5 million copies in months. You can connect those dots yourself. There's a comment that's been going around about all this that I think actually nails it. It's not technology, it's ideology. Koreans and Chinese aren't burdened by Western sensibilities and can create games that appeal to the target audience. Meanwhile, the West is still taking orders from ESG consultants. And another one that's equally direct, the main reason they're thriving is because major Western studios spent years prioritizing diversity checklists instead of fun gameplay. Korean developers are simply capitalizing on a massive market vacuum left by a declining Western industry. Yeah, that's what's happening. And the good news, or at least the encouraging part, is that unlike a lot of Western developers whose egos won't let them admit any of this, the Japanese are being completely honest. Itsuno actually said that the more creators come out of Korea making unique games, the more it raises the level of the entire global video game scene. And he's right. This competition might be exactly what forces everyone, Japanese studios included, American studios included, to drop the identity politics and just make games for the people who are actually out there buying and playing them. Voting with your wallet does matter. That's not a cliche. That's what's happening right now in real time. And that's the full diagnosis. Because I think it's important to see it as one connected thing and not just a collection of bad news items. The problem isn't only Bungie. The problem isn't only Naughty Dog. The problem isn't only the live service games flopping one after another. The problem is systemic. PlayStation had one of the strongest identities in this entire industry. At some point this generation, the executives forgot what that identity actually was, or maybe they just decided it wasn't enough anymore. Instead of protecting what PlayStation means, what it stands for, what it built its entire reputation on, they decided to chase trends. The executives got scared, and I get it. I understand the fear because they don't want to keep spending enormous sums on games that sell great one time and then never generate revenue again. So now the thinking is that everything needs to be a forever game, a live service, something people come back to every week for years. And the cruel irony is that this philosophy creates its own disaster, because the projects become bloated and expensive, the studio's identity gets completely lost in the process, and you end up with nothing that actually works because players don't have time or energy for half a dozen live service games simultaneously. Nobody does. Sony built its greatest studios around the cinematic single-player experience. That's what Naughty Dog was designed for, trained for, built over decades to deliver. That was PlayStation's bread and butter. That was the identity. And trying to force Bungie into being the guide for a live service transformation across the entire company, while nudging studios like Naughty Dog to start thinking in that direction too is like telling a chef who spent their whole life perfecting their craft that they're now an astronaut. It doesn't work. These are completely different skill sets, completely different mindsets, and it turns out that even Bungie, the actual live service specialists, the people who literally invented this model with Destiny, can't make it work under these conditions. So what does Sony end up with? Games made for nobody, half of them canceled before they even launch, the other half failing anyway, and all of it at enormous cost. It's kind of like building a character in an RPG, right? Sony's single-player side is the warrior class, high strength, high defense, built for exactly that kind of fight. The live service side would be the rogue, completely different style, completely different skill tree, and Sony is not committing hard enough to make either one actually work. They're distributing skill points equally across everything at the same time, trying to be both things simultaneously, and the result is a character who isn't really good at anything. They've got some strength, but they're not as strong as the studios that went full warrior like Nintendo, where you literally cannot play their games without buying their hardware. They've got some live service presence, but they're never going to reach the level of a Call of Duty. It's a disaster of a build, man. The only real way out of a build like that is a full respec, and if that option is off the table, sometimes you just have to restart the whole game, because the build Sony is running right now is just not viable. The lesson isn't complicated. Pick a class and commit to it. Don't try to be everything at once. It doesn't work. It never works. And that's kind of why everyone looks back at the PS4 era with so much affection, right? Because it was dominant and it was confident. It felt like Sony knew exactly what it was good at, what it stood for, and it just committed to that. Every year there was something. God of War, Horizon, Spider-Man, The Last of Us Part 2. Whatever you thought of them individually, there was a clear identity there. Now it just feels strange. Games get delayed, projects just disappear without explanation, studios close. Naughty Dog announces intergalactic years in advance, specifically to generate hype for a game that might not come out before 2028. Bungie is sitting idle, doing nothing. The digital graveyard keeps getting new entries. And while all of this is happening internally at Sony, Korean and Chinese games are selling tens of millions of copies by doing exactly the opposite of what Sony has been doing. That contrast is hard to ignore. PlayStation became successful because it delivered premium experiences that people genuinely loved. That was the whole thing. That was the entire foundation. And what we're seeing now is what happens when a company starts chasing a future that isn't theirs, while the present they built is crumbling around them. If Sony doesn't genuinely change course, if they don't stop these misguided bets on live service games that nobody asked for, if they don't fix the narrative problem that's been alienating the fan base since The Last of Us Part 2, if they don't go back to protecting the identity that made PlayStation special in the first place, then this generation is just going to keep sinking. And the competition outside, which doesn't carry any of these ideological weights, which is just focused on making games people want to play, is going to keep advancing. And eventually, it won't even be a question of Sony recovering. It'll be a question of whether the damage was already too permanent to fix, and I really, genuinely hope it isn't. But the clock is ticking, and right now, Sony doesn't seem to hear it.